to the first book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, chapter number 4. Hopefully after tomorrow, I'll have some type of glasses that I can see and wire at the same time. I can see y'all pretty good right now if I put my glasses on. Then I can't see anything. All y'all are just a blur. But I can read real good. So I don't know which. It's difficult to keep putting these on and off. But me and Joe's been going through some difficult times. I reckon the rest of you's had cataract surgery. And by the way, if you know somebody that's going to have cataract surgery, I have some medicine that's never been opened that they'll have to have, and we'll let them have it if you know somebody that's going to need that real soon. I believe Bob said, didn't you say Eddie may be going to need it? Didn't you say Eddie may be going to have cataract surgery? Who's that? Your wife. That woman you go home with every night. Okay. Okay, if you have your Bibles, we'll get through the nonsense here. 1 Samuel chapter 4. If you'll stand with us. We'll try to preach some from, I think, the first 22 verses, which is the whole chapter. We're not going to read all that. We'll begin in verse 1. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out against the Philistines to battle and pitched beside Ezer, and the Philistines pitched in Apec. And the Philistines put themselves in array against Israel. And when they had joined battle, Israel was smitten before the Philistines, and they slew of the army of in the field about 4,000 men. And when the people were come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, Wherefore hath the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, that when it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. You may be seated. I want to think about a few minutes about the results of when God is taken out of the camp. In a spiritual sense, I'm looking at the idea of when God is not fighting for us, or when God is not in support of the lifestyle that we're living. Not necessarily that we're lost, but we find out here that Israel went up against the Philistines, and they lost 4,000 men in this first battle, and we'll look at some more later on. But during this time, they were claiming to be God's people, and yet they were not recognizing God Himself. They depended on the outward things and the physical things, more so regarding the ark, more so than their relationship with God. I think that's still true today in many of our church families' lives, that we put more dependence upon the things that we look at physically than the things that we look at spiritually, and we fail to let God be God, and we put most of our importance as far as thinking about things on the things that really don't matter. The ark was only a physical symbol of the presence of God to the nation of Israel. It had no spiritual. I think sometimes that we put value upon things that really have no value. We look at church buildings. We look at things that we think about sometimes, and certainly they are included in our thought process. But our minds ought to be stayed upon God instead of the things that we're looking at. It's not the preacher. It's not the church building. It's not some of the things that we sometimes try to tell people about. But our minds ought to be on the things of God. Israel made a terrible mistake by depending upon self and depending upon a physical form of the things of God. The ark truly did stand for God, and it did represent His presence in the camp. But we find out that God wasn't standing with them. God wasn't fighting with them, and they lost the battle because of it. So we find out that it was that physical presence. I find out, first off, we'll look at 3 or 4 things quickly. The first off, they had the wrong view of God and who He was. They gave a devotion to the outward form of God, but not the real form of God or who God was. They looked at all the physical aspects of what the ark represented. Now remember, the ark was at Shiloh. They were about 20 miles away in battle. And Eli was the priest, and seemingly they thought everything was fine. And I believe that's one of the things wrong with our Christian walk today, that many times we come into the house of God and we do all the things that's expected of us, but we're not in the place where God wants us to be. Israel had the ark, and the physical presence of God was not with them, although what the ark stood for, representing God, was there. And they put all their dependence upon this physical form. They said, we've got the ark. We're God's people. And we're special. They were all that in certain way. But there wasn't living for God. And they had denied the things of God. And therefore God was in a position getting ready to judge them. And they didn't even realize it. They wasn't looking at the things of what the way God was looking at them, and they had the wrong view of everything about God. Their reliance was upon a form that did not secure the help of God. They depended upon this ark, and truly the ark was a special thing. The seraphim on top of it represented that God's presence was there. It wasn't what was inside the box exactly, but it was the whole nature of it. And they thought that God was obligated. And I think sometimes that we get the same idea that because we're Baptists or because we belong to this church or that church, or our family come to do this, and we think sometimes that we're special because of who we are. And they thought because they still had the ark that God was obligated to win their battles and fight for them and be a savior for them. But God wasn't going to do that with Israel in an attitude of a sinful nation. They used the symbol of God as a substitute for God Himself. They thought because they had the Ark of the Covenant there that they had the presence of God on their side. I think sometimes, and I'm sure in my own spiritual walk with God and listening to many others, that we think because we're a certain group or a certain people or a certain church that we have a special relationships with God that somebody else wouldn't enjoy. A lot of times we put down other denominations, and sometimes they're a whole lot more spiritual than what we are at times. So we ought to be careful how we relate to others. And here Israel thought they were somebody special because they had the Ark of the Covenant. They said, God's with us, that God's on our side. I've got news for us. God's not on our side. We better be on God's side instead of trying to put God in a spot where He has to do what we tell Him. It's best for us to do what God says, and I think that would get along further down the road. But they thought that God, that the ark was a symbol or a substitute. They also felt that they could force God into doing their bidding. They thought because they had the ark that God was obligated to do what they wanted. Notice what He says, I believe in verse 3 in the latter part. so that when it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. They thought they had that a special relationship. They thought they had God right where they wanted him, and he was under their control. They had him in a box, and he was under their control, and he had to win the battles because he was in their camp. Well, even when the box was in the other camp, it still didn't serve to win any battles for them. But they thought that God had to do what they thought. Have you ever heard people pray? Just listen sometimes to how, not necessarily here, but when you hear people pray, listen to how they put God in a position where they feel He has to answer their prayers. Lord, you've got to do this, and they pray in such a way that they feel they put God under an obligation to do certain things, and yet I find out that God's not obligated to do any of these things. We're obligated to serve Him and honor Him, but we need to keep it in that type of relationship. They disregarded the truth while worshiping the symbol. They had put God completely out of the picture. They had no personal relationship with Him. They was dependent totally upon this box that they had, and it represented everything to them about their religion and their God, but yet they left God out. And I believe sometimes that I see that not only in my personal life, but I see it in other lives, that we get the idea that God's obligated to do what I want Him to do. He's under some restraint that He has to do what I want Him to do. And they left the truth of everything that God was. They left the truth of that out of their personal life. They were not serving God. They thought that God was going to come to their rescue, but He didn't. They lost 4,000 lives here in this first battle, and they said, well, we'll just take the ark with us. Oh my, what a mistake that was for them to assume that they could take God into battle with them and remove Him from the place where He had designated that He'd be put. Now the ark had been designated to be in Shiloh. They felt that they could take the ark, which represented God Himself. They thought they could do whatever they wanted to, and God had to be under some restraint to do what they wanted. I find out that God doesn't work that way. They thought the ark was a proof of His presence with them, and they idolized the ark while only giving token worship to God. They recognized that they were God's people. They were Israel, but they put the importance upon the idea of the ark. Everything that you read in this whole chapter, you'll find out that everything they were doing, they were putting their confidence in a box that they had sitting there, and it only, it had represented God, and it still did, but they left their personal worship of God out of the picture. And I'm afraid that's what happens many times in our lives, that we've come to the point that we come into the house of God, we sing a few songs, and we go home and we leave God out of the picture, and we still got God in the box. We still have Him, but He has no power in our life. He has no authority. He's not getting anything done through us. We look back and we talk about what the church used to be. I got news for you. The church can still be exactly what God wants it to be today. We can still have power. We can still turn neighborhoods upside down. I remember when God, as a young person, when God moved through Calvary Baptist Church, and I still feel Him. He's not gone off anywhere, but I find out that many times that we progress to a point that we leave God out of the picture and we try to capture Him. He's in some symbol. He's in some episode that we talk about that used to happen, how revivals used to be. I realize most of outside of a handful of people in this room probably don't remember that church used to go 2 weeks. Every revival was 2 weeks. And now we try to get squeezed in between Sunday morning and Sunday night. That's about extent of revival anymore. We got God over here in a box, and He has to do what we say, when we say it, how we say it, or it doesn't happen. I got news for us. God didn't help them. God didn't fight their battle. God brought them to a place, and they wound up in defeat this day, all because they thought they had God figured out. I used to try to figure God out. I used to, try to devise the messages that I preached in order that they would, do a certain thing. But I found out that I needed to devise them to please God. I needed God to be the author and the finisher of everything that we say and that we do, that He might be honored and He might be glorified. And it has nothing to do with man. But I find out here that they idolized the ark. But notice also in verse 3, the ark was removed from its rightful place without God's command and for the wrong reason. They decided that if we take God with us in this little box that we're carrying, that God will be obligated to win the battle for us. Now, we just lost 4,000 men in this battle. And now they decide that they're going to take God with them. How that belittles God. God can't work from home. God can't do it from Shiloh. He's God over all, but yet they say we got to take God with us physically. We have to have some symbol, and I believe that's where we are today. That we're looking at how the church can do the things that it's supposed to be doing, and yet we leave God out of the picture. We put a restraint upon Him, and He doesn't get to work out of our hearts as He desires to, and we just leave God out of the picture. And here Israel thought, well, if we take God with us, now that's a good idea as far as knowing that God's with us, but when it comes to moving God from His rightful place, they were dethroning God. God had told them where to put the ark, and now the army decides that, well, we know best. And I've heard that many times through the church. That we know how to handle this. We know how to leave the business of the church to us, and we'll handle this and we'll do that. But I found out Israel thought that they said, yeah, we lost 4,000 men, but now remember, when they get the ark there, they have a hoorah time. They shout it down when they go back to the camp and take the ark back with them, and even they shout so loud that the enemy can hear them. Now I don't know how far they were in camps apart, but they let out a big shout. The Bible indicates that it rang out. They said, man, they were excited about having this box with them. But they still didn't have God. God still wasn't on their side fighting for them. God was opposing them. And I find many times that we think everything's going our way because things seem to be working out just the way we thought they were to. But they were doing it all for the wrong reasons. They put their trust in a box instead of the living God. They depended upon this box and everything that it stood for to win the victories for them. Instead of getting on their knees and calling upon God, they just lost 4,000 men. That's a sizable number out of any army. But it's going to get worse, and it's going to get worse because they haven't learned from their first problem. They're still doing it their way. They're still trying to say, we know how to do it. We know what we're doing. Just back off and let us have the day. And when they got the ark there, like I said, they shouted down. They had a glorious time that day. The enemy heard them, and the enemy said that it's none other. Notice what the enemy said. I believe in verse 7. It said the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God is come into the camp. And the word God there actually stands for the ark. And they said, woe unto us, for there hath not been such a thing heretofore. The enemy was scared to death of them. I mean, just because they figured they might have had some spies, I don't know, but they figured out it was because God, the ark, was in the camp. They finally, somebody may have snuck over there. They might have saw it on the other side of the hill. I don't know, but the Philistines here found out that the Ark of the Covenant was in the camp. But notice a little bit further. Verse 9. Be strong and quiet yourselves like men, O ye Philistines, that you be not servants unto the Hebrews, so they have been to you. Quiet yourselves like men and fight. And the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten. Here a moment ago, they were scared to death just because they heard the shout and they recognized the Ark of the Covenant was in Israel's army. Immediately, somebody encouraged them, said, you don't need to worry about them. They're already defeated. We can whip them. We can win the battle. Now remember, we're going to find out in a moment or two, 30,000 men die in this next battle. They just lost 4. 30,000 now are going to die because somebody in the camp of the Philistines said, don't pay attention to them. They don't have anything. That box that they carried in has no power. The Philistines, I believe, had a little bit more spiritual attitude about them than Israel did. Israel thought they were going to win the battle just because they brought a box along with them. But they did not have a God. And I believe in our spiritual walk many times, we face Satan every day, and we depend upon some box that we got, and we depend on something that happened 40 years ago in our spiritual walk, instead of realizing that we need God right now. We need God every minute of the day, and we need to depend upon Him to win the battle, and God will win the battle. So we find out that the ark was removed from its rightful place. They put their trust in the wrong place. When out of the will of God, there's always the danger of presumption. It amazes me that when I get out of the will of God, one of the biggest problems that I have is I start presuming that God's going to do this way, God's going to work that way, this is going to happen, this is going to work out this way, and I begin to line everything up in a way that I think it's going to work out. Israel thought because they had the ark of God in the camp that they were going to win the battle. One man stood up in Philistines and said, don't pay attention to them. We can win this fight. We can overcome them. We can I don't know if they were outnumbered or not, but I know that they won the battle because they believed they could. When out of the will of God, I always presume things. I think it's this one. It's my wife's fault. It's my cousin's fault. It's my aunt. It's the church's fault. It's the preacher. It's always somebody else's fault but mine. Always. I can always point a finger at everybody else and say, it's the deacon's fault. It's the choir's fault. They didn't sing the song that I really wanted them to sing. They didn't do this. And the church didn't follow this route. And they didn't do what I thought they was going to do here. It's always somebody else's fault but mine. I'm a presumptuous person when I get out of the will of God. I found also they did not see their defeat as a result of their sin. They never figured this part out. That they went down in battle on 2 different occasions here because of sin, and they never did realize that it was their sin. It was their fault. It was their problem. But they never did realize that. How many times have I went down defeat and never realized that Satan got the victory because I sinned, because I missed the mark, because I didn't obey God, because I didn't do what I was supposed to do. Satan wins the victory, and I never even realized that he's defeated me until it's already too late. They did not realize that it was a result of their sin. Instead of being bringing deliverance to Israel, the ark was captured. Instead of God winning we go through our spiritual life. Let me put it that way, with the idea that that we're some type of favored people because we're Baptists or whatever. That we think that God's got to do it a certain way. That He has to do this and He has to do that. God doesn't have to work on our timetable. He doesn't have to do it our way. If we trying to plan out God working in our lives the way we want Him to, you're going to be disappointed very quickly. You're not going to hold God hostage to do it your way. God's going to operate on His timetable when He desires and how He desires, and you know, sometimes that brings hurts in our life. And we think sometimes, I believe as a Christian, everything's supposed to be wonderful every day of the year. It's supposed to be Christmas all the time. But I got news for you, it's not going to be that way. There's going to be disappointments in our walk with God, and there's going to be times that things don't work out the way we think they ought to be, and we need to go to God and find out why. If Israel had went to the Lord and said, God, why are we losing the battle? I'm sure that God would have revealed Himself to them and pointed out why and what the problem was. But instead of bringing deliverance, Israel lost the ark. The ark itself never brought them a single victory. The ark itself never done anything. It sat there all day, all night, every day, every night, and did nothing. It was only a representative of God in the world. And Israel never, I don't believe they ever learned that. They went down defeat because they did not rely upon God, but they relied upon a symbol of God. And I believe that many times we live our life in the past and we want to live it like we used to. Or this is the way it used to be. We used to have this type of services, and God used to move this way. God can still do whatever He wants to do. We're not going to tie the hands of God that He cannot work only by our spiritual walk with Him. Ark never won any victories. The ark was captured. Suggests, the Scripture said later on, that the glory of God is departed. And we'll see that in a minute when they name a child Ichabod. But we find out that the ark being captured suggested that God's glory had departed. This represented God Himself in the world. And the Philistines have defeated us and taken our God into their camp. Now I believe in our spiritual walk with God, and we're still living that type of life sometimes. That we're allowing Satan to win the victory, and we live in defeat year after year after. After almost 40 years of pastoring, I've seen folk live defeated lives their whole adult walk with God. Never have any joy. Never have any sunshine. Never any brightness in their life. Never any happiness. Everything is a drudgery. Everything's something that's gone wrong in their life. They never have any joy. And you wonder what type of spiritual life are they living, never to enjoy anything of God. We ought to be a happy people. I know that we have sadness and there's heartache. There's all type of problems. That should not steal our joy. Yeah, we're going to have difficult times. That comes with the sunshine and with the rain, every other problem we have. But the child of God still ought to be able to stand and say, I got joy, joy, joy deep down in my heart. We ought to be able to tell the world that there's more to this thing than the circumstances that I go through every day. That I've got something, as I said a while ago, as a 10-year-old boy, God came into my heart and God changed me. Oh, I don't remember everything about it, and I didn't live the way I ought to have lived all that time, but I know that God did something. I know that He done a work that I could not do, and I thank Him for that. And I realize that the many in the church today think that they live as the rest of this story unfolds. Listen to what happens. The first thing we find out that, as we said, 4,000 was killed in the first battle that they faced. The second thing, in verse 10, you'll find out 30,000 was killed. 30,000 men died on the battlefield that day because they thought God was in the camp with them. Because they had some box that represented who God was and what God was doing in the world, they went down in defeat because, I wonder how many times, how many battles have we lost because we put our trust in a worldly thing. We depended upon a worldly circumstance and situation and did not depend upon God. They lost 30,000. Can you imagine that? This is 34,000 now that's died. 30,000 men died that day, and the rest of them fled. I don't know where they thought they was going to flee to when 30,000 of the army just got defeated. Most of them probably was headed back to wherever their homes was at, and yet we find out that it certainly wouldn't have took long for the enemy to catch them either. But I found out 30,000 was killed. In verse 11, Eli's 2 sons were killed. Now, they were part of the problem to begin with. If you go back and study this, they were handling the things of God for profit, and they were doing things, and Eli was letting them get by with it, which he certainly was going to face God for that. But I found out that Eli's 2 sons were killed. In verse 11, we find out that the ark of God was taken. So the ark of God was taken, the 2 sons were slain. One man went to tell Eli. And in verse 17, the messenger answered and said, Israel is fled before the Philistines, and there hath been also a great slaughter among the people. And thy 2 sons also are dead, and the ark of God is taken. And when it came to pass that he made mention of the ark of God, that he fell off the seat backward and broke his neck and died. He just found out that his 2 sons were dead. I'm sure that shook him. Now, Eli's blind. And I'm sure that it broke his heart to find out his 2 sons, whether they were in the will of God or not, it had nothing to do with it. But when he heard that the ark was captured, it was overwhelming. It broke his heart. Now, if you go back and study, Eli was a heavy man or a fat man, however you want to put it. Whatever the problem was, he fell off his seat and fell down backwards and broke his neck and died. Because the ark, that one thing that represented God to the nation of Israel, had been taken by the enemy. I'm afraid today that we're letting the enemy capture a lot of treasures from us. I'm afraid that we're turning over a lot of our family members to Satan and letting him have his way. Eli heard all this news and it broke his heart. And it also killed him. In verse 21, Eli's daughter-in-law was given birth. And she gives birth to Ichabod. And as soon as she gives birth, she dies. His name means the glory of God has departed. Even Eli's daughter-in-law recognized that God, because the ark had been taken, that God had departed from the nation of Israel. Here was the nation from the time they come out of Egypt was dedicated to one God, serving one God. Now we find out that God has departed them. There is no substitute when God is removed out of the camp. When the ark was taken and the Philistines had the ark, there's no substitute. When you and I allow Satan to gain the victories, there's no substitute. God doesn't always come in riding on a white horse and winning the day for us when we sin. There's a price to pay. They walked away from God. They put their trust in a box instead of putting it in God. I'm afraid today that we also, as modern day Christians, have put our trust in boxes instead of the living God. We depend on circumstances and things instead of depending on God. We say, I wish this will happen. I hope this happens. I trust this happens. Instead of getting on our knees before God and begging God for it to happen. There's many that's in this room tonight that has circumstances in our lives. I want to see God change. I've got family that's out of the will of God or lost. If God doesn't move, hell's going to be the final home. If God don't restore His glory to the church today and give us that power that we used to have. Now, I'm not saying that God's dead, but I am saying that the glory of God's departed out of Israel. And I believe He's departed out of many of our churches today. We're not what we used to be. I believe that's evident today. Our churches used to be full. Our churches used to have power with God. I remember when Calvary Baptist Church prayed, there's a theater screen right up the road. Wind blew it over. I remember when there was a liquor store up here at the red light, or a house that got sold liquor, and the church prayed. I believe it burnt down. God hasn't changed. We've changed. We've allowed the world to dictate to us how we're going to worship and how we're going to serve God, instead of us dictating to the world that our God's capable of doing anything that we ask Him. Ask you tonight if you too have somebody upon your heart, you want to just come and pray. We just meet God.